Keeping safety front of mind is all about communication. Welcome to the Farm Safety Roundup, a podcast series focused on important conversations to help keep farmers, their families, and their workers safe. Farm Safety Roundup is brought to you by the agricultural team at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. With today's timely topic, I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Let's get to it. Welcome to another episode of the Farm Safety Roundup. Your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. Farmers need to be vigilant to keep their families and workers grain safe. Now, not only during the rush of harvest season, but all year round. Anyone working in the grain industry should have a clear understanding of how grain entrapment happens and be well equipped to prevent or respond to what could be a truly catastrophic incident. Ryan Dick is a health and safety consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, joining from his farm in Douglas, Ontario. We're going to look today at the risks associated with grain handling and storage, more specifically grain entrapment, and why seconds count. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Shaun, thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so important topic, and this is one where we need to be up to date on the latest and some of the information and the research. So, and when I think about grain entrapment, one of the things I've learned over time is it happens fast. These situations. Within seconds, an adult can sink, and even at knee height, it becomes impossible to get free from it without any sort of help. So to prevent grain entrapment, you need to understand the danger of flowing grain. How and where do grain entrapment incidents typically happen?
Well, Shaun, most grain incidents happen in the grain bin, unfortunately, but it's not just in the grain bin that these incidents happen. They can happen when you're unloading trucks. They can happen in elevator pits. They can happen in gravity bins and wagons. Typically speaking, though, the main ways that we see these entrapment incidents happen is either the worker is trapped in flowing grain, so they're not either not paying attention to themselves, or the grain's moving faster than they thought, and it overcomes them. The other ways is when you find a bridge collapse in which a worker is walking across the top of the grain and there is a void that's not seen beneath it. So the weight of the worker causes that void to collapse in. And a lot of the time in those situations, that worker may be completely engulfed. And then finally, the other third way that we see a lot of these grain entrapment situations happening is when sidewalls of bins collapse. People enter the bins believing the bin is empty because the grain is off the floor. But if you look up around the walls, there can be several tons sometimes stuck against the ceilings and the sides. And when they come down, that's an awful lot of weight coming crashing out on the worker involved.
Yeah, I can remember as a kid, hey, go play on the grain pile.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was, you did those things on the farm. No, definitely not a good idea with
No.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, well, what we've learned over the years, right? I remember doing the same, and it's very difficult. We take our kids to the fair, and the first thing we do is say, go play at the grain table. And then we take them back to the farm and say, no, don't go in the grain.
Yeah. Okay. So being prepared and well equipped here are a big part of prevention and rescue efforts. So talk about that.
Yeah, being prepared is a huge portion. If these incidences happen, there's not a whole lot of time for anything to not be prepared. So the best way to do that is to have things thought of in advance. Make sure that you've done some written hazard assessments. Be aware of what the risks are going into a bin before anybody ever goes into it. Make sure you've got written procedures on how things are going to be dealt with, when they can go into the bin, what they need to go into the bin with. If something were to happen as well, it's very important to have all employees trained on rescue procedures, what needs to be done, who needs to be doing what roles, and have that stuff done ahead of the time. Because if you're waiting till the moment of an incident to happen to start thinking about these things, chances are you're not going to have either the equipment necessary on hand, the knowledge levels, or the capabilities to perform that rescue operation.
You mentioned something there that's very critical. It's one thing to have the procedures and them written down, but it's the training part of it, right? That
training is so important
if you don't do that.
Yeah, having the procedures is great. That's a first step by far. But having a procedure, but having nobody trained on how to run it is really no help at all. You want to have procedures in place and knowledge training done so that workers can carry that out through habit. not in a panic state of mind. If we've at least got some memory muscles to fall back on, we can get through a lot of these stressful situations having that advanced knowledge. But if you wait, you're done.
Now, you mentioned a lot of this is happening sometimes in the bin. So one of the ways to prevent bad situations from occurring is to keep people out of that situation and keep them out of the bin. So, like, talk about some of that prevention from that standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we would never have to see somebody go into a bin. It'd be something that'd be really nice if we never had to go into, but unfortunately, reality in farming is not quite that way, and there are plenty of reasons why we do end up having to go into a bin in the first place. But some of the things you can do to prevent the risk or minimize those risks is to make sure you're putting that grain away in a good condition in the first place. Make sure when you're filling those bins that it's good condition grain, the moisture levels are appropriate. Make sure you're keeping those bins in good condition. If you've got a hole in the bin, make sure that's being patched in before the seasons, because once that moisture gets into the bin, then you can have things like the bridging being created and the spoiling, the heating. You can also do things like placing warning signs on all the bins and wagons to make sure everybody's aware that that is a confined space and not made for human habitation. And whenever possible, secure those areas to make sure that unauthorized access can't be done, especially with the kids on the home farm. Very difficult to make sure the kids aren't playing around those bins. You want to make sure that's very evident to them about the dangers and risks.
Yeah. Inevitably, work like cleaning and maintenance, repair, it does need to get done. So if somebody does need to go into the bin in normal course of business, what are the appropriate steps they need to take?
There's a couple of things that you can do. First and foremost, you have to recognize that these grain bins are, for all intents and purposes, confined spaces. Especially depending what commodity is in there, you should be getting some air quality testing done before you're putting workers in there. Once you've got that air quality testing done, though, a couple of things that you can do. Number one, first and foremost, never work alone. Never ever work in a grain system on your own. Always have a buddy system. Don't go into the bin or cross grain if you're not wearing a safety harness and a lanyard lifeline. That can be a huge difference between rescuing somebody and having to find somebody that's in the bin. If anybody's, make sure you've communicated with all workers that are present in or around that bin. Make sure everybody is aware if anybody is going into that bin and what has to be done for them to make sure that person stays safe, as in making sure you're not unloading any other trucks, making sure the elevator legs have the proper baffle positioning on. And one of the biggest things that you can do is, as I mentioned, not go into the bin without the buddy system in place and having those rescue things. When we know we have to go into a bin, one thing that a lot of people don't consider is contacting the fire department first. For many of us, it's rural fire departments that are going to be the ones that are attending or responding to any rescue calls that happen. Very important to talk to that department beforehand. Find out if you do have rural firefighters or firefighters or any department trained in grain entrapment rescue. If not, it's a good idea to at least talk to them about it so you are aware of what services are available at your facility.
So let's just go with the scenario, the unthinkable happens here and somebody is in some form or fashion trapped. Time here is of the essence. Like in just a split second of time can mean the difference between rescue and recovery versus something
Absolutely
worse, right? So take us through some of the best practices.
Well, as you said, seconds count. Every second counts in these situations. So to make sure that you've got those precious seconds that we need, have a couple of steps taken beforehand. So when we talked about prevention, you want to make sure that bin is kept clean around the outside, that access is not being prevented by equipment or implements that are in the way. You want to make sure that you don't have to waste that couple of precious seconds to move that piece of equipment when the paramedics are showing up. You want to make sure you've got the other equipment you need. Make sure you've got lanyards and safety harnesses for all workers that are going to be working in and around it, or at least have one extra beyond the person that's wearing it. Grain bins, like an old barrel or tubes, they're wide enough for a person to fit into, are key as far as isolating that worker from the additional flowing grains, to help isolate them sinking further. One of the things, though, is important, though, to understand is if we do have to get into a bin to do a rescue situation, any rescuers going in are going to be in the same risk of being entrapped. So you want to make sure we're having steps in place for that. So keep 2x8s, 2x6s, or ladders near those bins as well, that if you ever do have to go out onto it, you can put those boards down or the ladder across to distribute the weight of the rescuer. So when they are going into the bin, there's that much of a chance, a better chance of them accessing the person. Also, don't put additional pressure on the victim. A lot of the time, what some people may think to do is I've got the lanyard, I've got that safety line held onto it. We've had an incident, so therefore the first thing I should do is pull him out. There's a lot of weight on that in that grain. We all know a lot of the densities we're talking with grains. That's going to be a lot of pressure on the person. So keep in mind as well that when they're exhaling, that grain is going to kind of collapse into around that chest cavity as well to make the inhale so much harder. So we'll talk about that as far as if you're in the position at that point. And yeah, ventilate those bins. Make sure you've got some aeration systems going in there. Make sure the workers are wearing all the PPE required, not just that safety line. You're in a dusty environment. We have to consider the other risks involved as well. And that being said, anytime we are in a grain entrapment, chances are we're moving that grain. It's going to produce a lot of dust. On a normal time, I can hold my breath for a little while when I'm not stressed. If I'm stressed and it's poor air quality, I'm probably not going to be able to hold my breath nearly as long.
Staying calm is critical, but boy, that's easier said than done.
Is it ever, Shaun? I mean, you know, you can tell somebody to stay calm all you want, but they're just words. But we talked today a little bit about training earlier on. This is where it does make the big difference, or can make a difference. If I am trapped in a grain bin and I know my coworkers have done 2 training sessions this year on worker rescue, if I'm in that grain, I have more confidence with my coworkers and anybody else on site that I will be rescued. I may not panic nearly as much. But if I'm in that bin and we have never discussed rescue, and I realize I'm in that position of being trapped, it's very difficult for someone not to panic, especially if they're working alone, if they've negated that buddy system or have not done those risk assessments. Very, very easy to have those things happen. Worst case scenario, if you ever find yourself that you are trapped in grain, especially once it gets past the knees, it's very important to stop struggling. The more you struggle, the worse you're actually going to make the entrapment. And if you get past the chest, as I mentioned, then we're going to start to run the risk of having restricted breathing potential.
Yeah.
It's easier said than done to stay calm, as we've mentioned. But if you're ever in a situation where that's the point and it looks like it's getting worse, that there's a chance that you may be fully submerged, it's very important to keep your hands vertical as far above your head as possible. And the reason for that being that extra couple of inches of the hand sticking above the grain may make a huge difference as far as where the rescuers try to find you.
Wow. Okay. So summarize for us key takeaways that we need to remember on this topic of grain entrapment.
Key takeaways to remember is that they are confined spaces. That every farm, that these are very hazardous situations, and you should be conducting proper risk analyses. Anybody that's working in that situation should be aware of what the risks are for entrapment, as well as for the dust, for the noise, and how to control those. It's an employer's due diligence to requirement on that. Have those written hazard assessments, have written procedures on how to enter the bin and how to do the work within the bin, as well as that rescue procedure, and practice the rescue procedure. It is no good at all if it is not second nature to anybody. And it's not saying you have to practice it on a daily basis, but definitely if you're going into the season where you're moving your grains, spending an hour practicing on a mock rescue situation will make an immense difference if that situation ever occurs.
Ryan, this has been very important discussion. Thanks for sharing this vitally important message. The Canadian Agricultural Safety Association has some great resources as well, including training for local fire departments. You can go to Be Grain Safe on the Canadian Agricultural Safety Association website, and you can access easy-to-use resources like a hazard checklist at wsps.ca/farm safety. Ryan, thanks for joining us today on the Farm Safety Roundup.
Thanks for having me, Shaun. It's always great to be here.
With agricultural expertise to help keep farmers, their families, and their workers safe, Farm Safety Roundup is a podcast series produced by Real Agriculture with the team of ag specialists at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. Go to the website wsps.ca/farmsafety. There you're going to find free health and safety resources, and you'll also be able to check this episode's show notes for information on the topics discussed. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time to talk all things farm safety right here on the Farm Safety Roundup.